On the morning of September 11, 2001, 4 planes were taken from the skies above America. 3 would strike their targets, but the 4th, United Flight 93, would become something else entirely. A flight scheduled as routine, bound from Newark to San Francisco, transformed into a coffin of whispers, smoke, and desperate voices. Its story has been told in official reports, in interviews, in history books. But what lingers, what chills to the bone, are the last phone calls. The trembling voices carried through thin lines of static. The final words that no one was meant to hear. For 29 minutes after the hijacking, passengers and crew reached for seat-back earphones and cell phones, clutching them like lifelines. And what they said, what was recorded, what was remembered, is not just evidence of courage. It is a record of terror, of confusion, of a creeping dread that even now feels inhuman. Because behind the static of those calls, beyond the official story, lies an atmosphere that feels darker, heavier, as though the plane itself became a vessel, not just of tragedy, but of something unexplainable. Something that makes Flight 93 more than a story of loss, it is a haunting. This is not just the history of a plane that never reached its target. This is the story of its last phone calls, and the shadows that echoed inside them. It began like any other morning flight. The cabin filled with the usual shuffle of briefcases, murmurs of passengers settling in, the tired sighs of early business travelers. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. But beneath the routine was something heavier. Passengers would later describe the atmosphere before takeoff as strangely still. A silence that wasn't just quiet, it was watchful. It lingered in the aisles, thick in the recycled air. Almost as if the plane knew what was waiting for it. Flight 93 left the ground at 8:42 a.m. 26 minutes later, the world below was already unraveling in fire and smoke. By 9:28, while the passengers sat strapped in, turbulence wasn't the only thing that shook the aircraft. The cockpit was seized, and the plane plunged suddenly, unnaturally, in a violent drop. What came next was chaos, but not the kind you imagine in movies. There was no screaming in unison, no cinematic shouts. It was stranger, more unnerving. A scattered panic. The sound of bodies shifting, gasps caught in throats, a low, desperate confusion. A cabin filled with questions no one dared to ask out loud. And then, silence. A silence broken only by muffled orders in a language most did not understand. A silence pierced by the realization that this was no ordinary hijacking. In that silence, passengers turned to the only lifeline left, the thin plastic earphones embedded in the backs of seats. The first calls began. They were rushed, whispering, strained by fear. And yet, each one seemed to carry something beyond words. A weight. A darkness between the sentences, as though the calls themselves were being swallowed by the plane. Those last phone calls, made in desperation, would reveal not only what happened inside Flight 93, but something more chilling. Something that still feels unexplained, even after decades of investigation. At 9:30 a.m., the cabin of Flight 93 was gripped by something far worse than turbulence. By now, news of the attacks on New York was reaching the ground. But the passengers in the air, locked inside a hijacked plane, knew almost nothing, except for what they could hear. The first calls went out. A flight attendant reached her husband. A businessman dialed his wife. Each call came through with an edge in the voice, a trembling urgency. They spoke of knives. Of threats. Of the cockpit sealed by force. Yet there was something uncanny about those calls. They carried not just fear, but a kind of resignation. A creeping knowledge that they were already standing in death's shadow. Some spoke in rushed fragments, others in whispers, as though afraid the plane itself was listening. One call lasted only seconds, cut short by static that hissed through the receiver. Another ended with a sharp intake of breath, as if the passenger had seen something, or someone, standing in the aisle. What exactly interrupted that call has never been explained. For those on the ground, receiving these words, the horror was twofold. They heard their loved ones alive, desperate, clinging to the line, while knowing there was nothing they could do but listen. The walls of the aircraft became a tomb, and the phone calls its echoing voices. And within those voices was a detail too strange to ignore. Several family members later described an eerie quiet behind the words, as though the cabin was wrapped in an unnatural hush, punctuated only by the sound of breathing. Not shouting, not the chaos you would expect. Just breathing. Heavy, ragged, relentless. As though death itself was seated among them, waiting. Each call was more than a message. It was a fragment of a nightmare, carried across the airwaves. A record not only of what happened, but of what it felt like, the creeping sensation that the passengers of Flight 93 were not alone. By 9:40 a.m., the calls from Flight 93 had changed. They were no longer just whispers of knives and locked doors. They became revelations, fragments of a nightmare pieced together in real time. Through shaky voices and frantic words, the passengers learned what had already happened. 2 planes had struck the towers of New York. A third had slammed into the Pentagon. And slowly, horribly, they understood, their own plane was meant to be next. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Fear was no longer shapeless. It had a face now. A target. The passengers were not hostages waiting for ransom. They were weapons, flying toward a destination they would never choose. The calls captured that transformation. Some spoke of goodbyes, voices cracking under the weight of final words. Others described strange details, the smell of fuel, the metallic taste in the air, the sight of the sky tilted at unnatural angles as the plane veered off course. One passenger described a sound, a low, rhythmic pounding, as though something were striking against the very frame of the aircraft. No one could explain it. And in those last conversations, a new tone crept in. Not just fear, but defiance. A quiet, determined terror. Words spoken like confessions to the void. Plans whispered between breaths. The calls captured it all, the slow, chilling shift from helpless victims to desperate fighters. But even then, beneath the courage, something else lingered. Several relatives recalled an odd distortion on the line. A hollow echo. A feeling that their loved one's voice was coming from somewhere far deeper than the cabin of a plane. Almost as if the aircraft itself was speaking through them. These were not just final calls. They were transmissions from the edge of life, carrying not just words but the heavy, suffocating presence of what awaited them. The air itself had become hostile, thick with inevitability. And yet, within it, the passengers of Flight 93 made their choice. They would not go quietly. At 9:57 a.m., the final calls from Flight 93 poured through the air like messages carved into stone. Voices that shook with fear now spoke with certainty. The passengers had made their decision. They would fight back. On the ground, family members heard the shift. Words grew faster, breaths sharper, as if each heartbeat thundered against the phone lines. Chairs were lifted. Trays slammed. The quiet whispers of the earlier calls were gone, replaced by a storm inside the cabin. And then, nothing clear. Just fragments. Heavy thuds. Muffled cries. The sound of a struggle echoing through the static. One call ended mid-sentence, cut off in a sudden silence that felt more final than words ever could. Another faded beneath a roar, an unnatural, mechanical scream that some said sounded like the engines. Others swore it didn't sound like machinery at all. At 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 plummeted into a lonely field in Pennsylvania. No one aboard survived. But their last calls, those desperate transmissions through wires and static, remain. Not just as historical evidence, but as something more. Something heavier. Because when you listen closely, when you hear the recordings and read the transcripts, there's a presence inside them. The sense that the cabin of Flight 93 became more than a battleground. It became a liminal place, suspended between life and death, courage and despair, earth and sky. The calls did not simply carry words. They carried atmosphere. Fear so thick it bent the airwaves. Determination that still vibrates decades later. And something else, something that cannot be explained, only felt. Today, the ground where Flight 93 fell is quiet. A memorial rises, solemn and still. Yet some say that on certain nights, when the wind cuts across the Pennsylvania fields, there are whispers. Faint, trembling voices carried like static in the dark. The last echoes of phone calls that should never have existed, but refused to be silenced. This was United Flight 93. And these were